Now, Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa has vowed to revive an economy that has collapsed under his watch as he launched his bid for a second five-year term. Now, Zimbabwe will hold presidential and parliamentary elections on the 23rd of August, which are expected to pit the 80-year-old Mnangagwa of the ZANU-PF party against pastor and lawyer Nelson Chamisa of the Citizens Coalition for Change. The election comes amid a raging economic crisis with high inflation and currency that has plunged more than 50% this month against the US dollar. Now, in remarks aimed mostly at his rural support base at the weekend, Mnangagwa pledged infrastructure development. Mnangagwa toppled independent Zimbabwe's first president, Robert Mugabe, in a coup in 2017, ending his 37-year rule. He was hailed as a pragmatic leader shortly after taking power, but he scored only a narrow win in 2018 elections over Chamisa, who is still considered the stronger challenger to his re-election bid.
Farai South African correspondent Farai Muvuti joins us now to take a look at the upcoming Zimbabwean elections. He will be discussing the campaign, the chances of the presidential candidates, as well as the incumbent President Emmerson Mnangagwa alongside their manifestos. It's good to have you with us, Muvuti. Okay. I'm sure you can hear me. Okay, so let's go straight into it. Now, 11 candidates are set to run for the Zimbabwean presidency after several hopefuls were disqualified for failing to raise the $20,000 needed to appear on the ballots. Now, the election is expected to pit incumbent Emmerson Mnangagwa of the ZANU-PF party against pastor and lawyer Nelson Chamisa of the Citizens Coalition for Change, who is seen as his strongest challenger. Now, can you provide an overview of the manifestos that have been put forward by these presidential candidates? What are their policy proposals, the key promises? How do they aim to address the pressing issues faced by Zimbabwe, such as the economy, social welfare, corruption, and even governance?
No, thank you yet again for having me. And yes, so far it's been one political party that has presented its manifesto, which is the ruling party, ZANU-PF, led by the incumbent, who is Emmerson Mnangagwa. And what we're seeing from the manifesto proposals is a continuation of what they term to be agenda, which the national development strategy, which is anchored on a 2030 strategy, in which they intend to see economic growth premised primarily on three areas of industry: so agriculture, your area of mining, and equally manufacturing. So far, they are arguing that they've been able to increase the mining base by 34%, getting much more localized products going into the shopping centers of Zimbabwe. They've been able to grow the GDP contribution of the agricultural sector from 3 billion to about 8 billion. And they intend to do the same with the mining area, which their projected growth in the next year or two should be 12 billion. So that's what they're arguing. On the other side, which is, of course, your opposition party, which is CCC, a citizen coalition collective led by Nelson Chamisa, is arguing that, well, in as much as they haven't presented their manifesto, they are much more, of course, leaning towards an economic proposal that they are arguing that they want to reform the banking structure. They wanted to have tackle the concept of corruption and equally confront the issues relating to electoral reform and so forth. Then there is a dark horse that comes in, who is in the name of Kasugwere, who does not actually have a political party, but is a former government official that has now actually entered the race. So amongst the 11, these are the three prominent characters that are being presented.
All right, Farai, am I reading too much meaning to the statement made by the president, Emmerson Mnangagwa? We know he's 80, and he made a statement that is quite striking. He says, and I quote, that he has vowed to do what we can to remain in power. This is almost reminiscent of another Robert Mugabe here. Or am I reading too much meaning to what he has just said?
I mean, perhaps we are. I think we may be reading this too deeply. I think any political player has ambitions to retain power. So his argument may be the same argument that Biden can make, and equally that any political player around the world would make. If you're in a position of political power, your fundamental job, in order for your aspirations for the country to be pursued, is to retain that power. So he's making the case that he has every intention to make his argument forward, to proffer his argument and ensure that he wins the political elections. No one goes into an election and you can never talk to Mike Tyson before he goes into a match and say, do you anticipate to lose? And he says yes.
I mean, in my initial question, you've spoken about a new entrant into Zimbabwe's August presidential race. And a lot of people are saying that this could result in the division of the ruling party vote. According to political analysts, the entry of Kasu Kuwere might precipitate a presidential runoff. Now, this is someone who has served as a local government minister, as well as a youth leader, indigenization and empowerment minister in the President Robert Mugabe's government. Now, we're looking at this same individual who was also ZANU-PF's political commissioner and top party organizing post. What are your thoughts on this, and how much of a run for the money is he giving these other two strong contenders?
Well, I think there is something to be said about that, considering the fact that historically, I think the people that are making that assessment in terms of dividing the vote could be making the considerations of 2008, when we had the introduction of Simba Makoni, and you had the introduction of and Simba Makoni, equal to Kasu Kuwere, had a huge legacy in having been the former finance minister of Zimbabwe at the time. And then equally, you had Arthur Mutambara, who led the MDCN, because the MDC, the opposition parties at the time, had a divided sort of vote. And then you equally had Changirai. So when they make that assessment, they are looking at it from that perspective, which is justified. But equally, when you look at ZANU-PF's history, this is not the first big character to come out of the party. And the circumstances in terms of the political terrain is fundamentally different. You have a clear CCC party who have also had problems in as far as through their own strategy of the strategy of ambiguity, in which they failed to actually list as many candidates, about 73, going already to ZANU-PF without even going into contestation. So the environment that is currently prevailing in Zimbabwe's political terrain is quite different, you see. So ZANU-PF goes in with a big advantage, and the only contradictions perhaps is the fact that a former minister and a former national commissariat officer, which is quite a considerable role, introduces himself into the election. Is there any evidence to suggest that he will be able to eat into the electoral numbers? I think so far it will be highly speculative, but as elections go, as you would know, the results would tell us. But from my assessment, I don't think that he will have the capacity to eat into that particular electoral vote, considering the amount of work that ZANU-PF has done in the last 5 years. He comes in as a new character in the nexus point of Zimbabwean politics. And he's not really, if you're in Zimbabwe, there's a saying, if you're not active, then you're not visible. And I think the lack of visibility in as far as his political ambitions in the last 2 to 5 years are equally going to be telling when it comes to the electoral result. But of course, you cannot deny that he is, he does have a lot of experience in the Zimbabwean field. He was one of the chief campaigners for ZANU-PF. So you cannot entirely disregard his capacity. But I think the political terrain currently, with CCC, with ZANU-PF, those are the major contenders. He perhaps, if he's looking to exploit internal contradictions within ZANU-PF, that is yet to be seen. But I think a lot of work has been done in that regard to sort of dispel that. But yet, as I've said, I'm willing to be corrected on that. But so far, based on my assessment, I don't think he has much potential to make a dent towards Mnangagwa's electoral processes or the eventual outcome.
All right, talk to me, Farai. I want to find out from you, do you think the current economic crisis in Zimbabwe will be the undoing of President Emmerson Mnangagwa, understanding that the reports are that 100 Zim dollar is not even enough to buy a piece of egg at the moment, that about 10,000 Zim dollars is equivalent to $1 at the moment. Do you think the economic crisis in the last couple of months will be fatal undoing? Talk to me.
So I think to understand Zimbabwe, somewhat like Nigeria, if you look at what some of the Tinubu reforms that have introduced in relation to, removal of subsidies and reforming the Reserve Bank itself, some of those contradictions are equally prevalent in Zimbabwe as well. But if you speak to different constituencies, for instance, the urban voter's lived experience will be fundamentally different to the rural voter. The rural voter makes up about over 70% of the voting population. And the rural voter has been advantaged with the mining contracts, the artisanal miners. 52% of Zimbabwe's gold reserves is provided for by people who live in the rural area. If you consider your food supply in Zimbabwe, that's your rural area constituency. Subsistence farmers collectively have been able to create the bumper harvest you've seen in wheat production, have equally been able to create a bumper harvest in as far as the grain output. So they are at the citadel of economic activity. So their reading of these particular realities, considering that they're a large voting bloc, may not have such a dire impact as one reads it, in contradiction to, of course, or rather in comparison to your urban voter. So these different constituencies will read them differently. But fundamentally, if you're looking at the voting constituency, that bloc is the dominant economically active bloc. So we may see a favorable outcome for ZANU-PF if indeed they're able to harvest that particular vote.
Well, given Zimbabwe's history of electoral disputes and controversies, what measures are being put in place to ensure a free, fair and transparent election process? And what about the role of the international community as well in observing and supporting the electoral process? What efforts have been made to facilitate international observers and ensure their impartiality as well as the impact that their presence might have on the credibility and acceptance of the election results?
Well, that's a bit of a funny point because historically, if you look at the AU, the SADC region, when as far as the electoral outcome, they have always given the electoral output a clean bill of health. Maybe aside your 2008. But in the main, you've had a clean bill of health, even in the last election, where you had observers all the way from the United States, in which people like senators, who I forgot their name, it escapes me, but they actually gave the election a clean bill of health, where there were occurrences of political violence, or rather violence by virtue of the protests that occurred. There was a Motlanthe Commission that gave recommendations that, of course, perhaps by virtue of the engagement of those that are in the opposition and in parliament, they can hold. I'm sure that they've been able to further look into if those issues have been actually resolved. But the irony, furthermore, in this regard, is that the opposition leader, the main opposition party in this instance, being Nelson Chamisa, has been public in saying that they themselves have come up with the mechanism of holding the government accountable in as far as any contradictions with relation to the electoral outcome. They are very confident that they will not be rigged, and they have come up arguing that. Even though, to give you a bit of a background, in the past, they had argued that they had created in 2018. They had argued that they had processes that they put in place to be able to hold the government accountable, especially the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, which, by the way, is part of their ideation as far back as 2007. And they went to court, and the court processes were published publicly, and they failed to present the evidence, or at least based on the electoral and the judgment that we then saw, in which they were able to make this case between three particular institutions, which is Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, that had its lawyer and its representatives, and to lay out their case, as well as the ruling party and the opposition party. And in this process, the judges felt that they had failed to make the case that the elections were rigged. So in this particular instance, they have made the argument that this time they'll be able to ensure that they collect sufficient evidence to enable them to, if the outcome is not listed or is not registered as they would like it to be, they will have the recourse to ensure that they will be preserved in as far as what their work is considered to have been in terms of substantiating the claim that the election will be rigged.
All right, Muvuti, I want to say thank you very much for joining us here on Newsday.